Okay, welcome to this introduction to educational research using the University of Winnipeg Library. My goal here is not to go through every single element of research in education, but more so to show you some basic ways to get started and some of the main pitfalls that you might encounter doing research in education using our library's resources, some of the main pathways into the good stuff. So let's begin first by just talking about what would bring you to the library to do education research. That is usually centered around finding academic sources for a research paper or research assignment. So, in education, often this will be coupled with some sort of practical aim, like developing an instructional plan or assessing and critically evaluating curriculum documents, that kind of thing. So, usually you're going to use the research in education as the basis for developing educational interventions or understanding educational contexts better and using that as the evidence to support your practice in education. So here we'll imagine that we're looking for scholarly sources about a particular topic to help us inform our practice in education. So where are we going to find those sources? Well, the best place to go for good, solid academic sources is through the library, and in particular through the library's subject area databases. For education, you can get to our databases under the databases link here, just above the main search box. You can click to open up our databases. You can choose your subject area beneath the subject dropdown, so you can kind of narrow things down to particularly relevant databases. Here we found 21 databases for education, including one simply called the Education Database from ProQuest, ERIC, which is the one I'm going to talk about today, and then also PsycInfo. It's a psychology database, but it's one that has a lot of content related to how people learn, and so that can be a useful one as well. Let's open up the ERIC database. And this is where we can search for whatever search terms we want to identify within the literature. And there's lots of added features centered around finding materials relevant to people doing educational research. So if we imagine we're looking for information about the use of artificial intelligence tools in education, we can search a very simple kind of phrase, and a lot of students approach it this way. They drop in some sort of phrase like this or a set of keywords and just kind of see what's available. So let's begin with that. So we have AI in education. We get 4,565 results, which is an enormous number of results. But within this, we can scroll to look and see what kinds of things we found. Now, it's possible that the scope of your research is, in fact, this broad. But the reason that a topic this broad can be challenging is that it embodies a lot of different elements, right? So assessing the value of AI in education can't really just be done on its own. We can't just say, AI is good for education or AI is a challenge to education, because that can mean a lot of different things, right? And so to really find meaning in the sources that we want to use, we're going to need to be a little bit more targeted than this. A way that we can accomplish this is by looking through a results set like this, scrolling through and making note of different categories of sources, different angles that researchers take at examining this broad concept. We can also just sort of use our own brainstorming and critical thinking to ask ourselves, what are the main aspects of AI in education that we might look into? It's still possible for us to bring all of these elements back together in how we write about it. So you can indeed write a research paper about this broad topic if that's what you want. The challenge then becomes identifying what are the different subtopics that you're going to examine, and then actually search for information on each of those. So flash forward here to a search that I've developed that's much more complex, certainly, but also one that touches on a more particular subtopic within the field of education and looking at AI tools. So it's more specific in that sense, but it also is bringing in more varied vocabulary of how we refer to things to try and capture more of the sources that touch on this topic. What this is going to do is allow for this kind of varied vocabulary in terms of AI, chatbots, other sort of forms of that concept, and then looking at a variety of terminology around disabilities and accessibility. So it's going to bring these two together, and we're going to see if we can find some sources that touch on that element specifically. Now, as I said earlier, this might be part of a larger research project where you're looking at different applications or different possibilities of AI in education. And this would just be one component of that larger topic. You might bring in other dimensions of this topic or other components like personalized learning plans, issues around critical thinking, de-skilling, and other concerns that people have around the use of AI in educational contexts. So there's lots of different ways to break this apart into its components. And I encourage you to do that when you have a large and complex topic like this. Think of the different components of it and search for those individually. And then as you learn about each of those things, you can bring them back together into your final paper, which will address each of them in turn using the evidence that you've found. So now I found 1/10 of the results, but this set of results will be much more useful at addressing that one subtopic than the broader search, which was just bringing back everything that mentioned AI and education. Another thing that you might be interested in is using some of these specific limiters along the left-hand side. So, as would be expected with a topic like this, looking at AI and chatbots, the majority of the literature exists in the past few years, but you can limit by date. And depending on what topic you're working with, you might find that this is more even, or that there might even be bumps in research interests in a topic. Some topics were very trendy in the 80s or 90s, and so you might see little blips over time where people were more interested in that topic. You can also use some of these other limiters down here to look for particular document types, particular subjects, particular audiences and educational levels. If we wanted to narrow further, we could specify a particular educational level. This one's really useful for students and researchers looking at particular levels of education, like high school, secondary, post-secondary education, early childhood education. So if you're teaching high school and you want to look at the use of AI tools to help students with disabilities, then these would be 18 sources that might be valuable for that type of research. So one hiccup that students often encounter when using a database like ERIC or some of our other subject area databases is that these are not necessarily full text databases. Some of the contents will be available in full text directly through the database, but often they are not. And so often we'll need to use links like this one that are get full text, and that's going to actually direct us to places potentially outside the initial database where we can get the full texts of these sources. So here it's directed us to a more stripped down page for ERIC where we can download the full text of this article, which is entitled Artificial Intelligence for Supporting College Students with Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, Cognitive, Emotional, and Ethical Perspectives. Okay, so the question that a lot of students ask once they get to this point where they're starting to find good relevant sources is, do these sources count as scholarly or academic sources for the purposes of my research assignment? So this can be sometimes a complicated question and sometimes a fairly easy question to answer. There's not kind of a one-size-fits-all answer to whether something constitutes a scholarly source, although usually what it means is that you have a fairly easy time arguing that the people who wrote and created that source are themselves scholars or have some level of expertise in that subject area. Most of the results that I've found are identified in the database as scholarly journals. Anything here labeled scholarly journal is likely from a journal that's peer-reviewed, that accepts publications from people with expertise and academic credentials in the field of study. And that's what you would be looking for when you're asked to use scholarly articles. So in cases where you need academic sources, and in particular when you're doing research in education, you're going to want to turn to databases like ERIC or the Education Database or some of the other ones we've identified in our collections. Turn to the library for these types of sources because that's where you're going to find the best quality information that counts towards those goals of finding scholarly sources. So I hope that that was helpful. Thank you very much for sticking around to the end of the video. As always, if you have questions about this or other aspects of library research, please come and ask us in the library or contact us through our website. And if you like these types of videos where we talk about search strategies, different collections, different databases, and other ways of finding academic sources, then please consider subscribing to the library's YouTube channel because we're going to release more of these, and we hope that they're helpful to students getting acquainted with library research. So get in touch, ask us questions, and like, comment, and subscribe, and all of that. Okay, so take care, and we'll see you around the library.